My name is Dan Quinn. I'm an extension corn agronomist and assistant professor of agronomy here at Purdue University. We're going to talk a little bit about just replant considerations for corn, what to look for, how to make some of the decisions, and in terms of whether or not we need to replant or whether or not we don't need to replant in terms of corn. So just jumping right in, right? These are a couple examples, a couple pictures I have of, issues you may run into or calls you may get from some farmers, whether it be some damage in their field in terms of, missing plants or poor emergence in their plants or in their fields or in certain areas or based on certain patterns. You might have, high residue issues, cover crop issues, no-till issues, just emergence issues in general. And typically the question is when you have these challenges, right, in terms of missing plants or poor emergence is whether or not should we replant, right? Should we replant? Should we leave it? Should we patch it in? Should we, terminate it and start over? Those are some of the big questions that often arise in terms of replant decisions. So the first question we have is, okay, where do we start, right? You get to a field, you see the issues in the field, certain questions of whether or not we should replant or not. So really, where do we start when it comes to making that decision? So really, it starts with stand assessment, right? And that really starts with your stand counts out in the field. The stand assessment is often really important in terms of the earlier you can do it, the better. So from emergence to the V3 growth stage or 3 colored leaves is a really good time to assess that stand after planting. It's also important to note in terms of replant decisions that they are not easy, right? Replant decisions are not easy because there's lots of different factors at play in terms of, planting date and replant costs and, trying to understand what the potential yield loss is or yield gained if we were to replant. So replant decisions are not easy. There's a lot of factors at play when we think about, whether we should replant or not. Potential yield losses are often very difficult to estimate. There's really no kind of linear relationship between, missing plants and yield reductions. So there's a lot of factors at play, right? So potential yield losses are often very difficult to estimate. Another big aspect, right, is the timeliness of decision. You want to make that decision fairly timely. So if we need to do something about it, we can do it in a timely fashion, right? So we're not waiting weeks before we need to replant. So the timeliness of the decision is important. And also with replant decisions, right, it's often dictated by economics, right? It's dictated by, do we have a replant policy or not? Do we have seed availability or not? What's the cost going to be if we're going to replant or how late it is in the season? So just trying to help you understand that there's a lot of factors at play. There's a lot of decisions and different aspects that we need to factor in and whether or not we are needing to replant. So it really starts with assessing that stand and understanding, okay, what is the stand? What are the stand counts? What is the number of plants do I have in certain areas that may be damaged out in the field, right? So how bad is it and what is remaining? That is often our first step when it comes to making replant decisions. So, when it comes to making that decision and understanding what is, left out in that field, it's important to do stand counts, right? And an easy way to do stand counts is to look at it in terms of 1/1000th of an acre. So you can get a pretty good estimate of what that population is or how far off are we from that targeted seeding rate that farmer may have. So here's kind of a quick, reference table. Most of the time you'll be in 30-inch rows. So if you measure out 17.4 feet of a certain row, that can give you an estimate of 1/1000th of an acre. It's really important to target multiple random locations within that effective area of the field to kind of gauge an average of what the potential stand loss is. It's not just targeting the really poor areas versus the really good areas. It's taking multiple random locations throughout the poor areas to get an idea of, okay, what is the average maybe plant population lost in those affected areas? And it's also not only important to look at, okay, what the stand is in that specific area, but also look at the plants, right? Assess the viability of the plants counted. You may take a stand count and you may have, say, 30 plants in 17.4 feet or 20 plants, but are all of those plants viable, right? So just because there's a plant there, right, is there any indications of regrowth, right? Is there new green leaves on the plants that may have been damaged? Is the seed germinated, right? So maybe you need to actually get down and dig out some of the seed. So just because there's a missing plant there doesn't mean we don't have a germinated seed below that soil surface. So it's important to not only count the plants that are in the effective areas, but also assess the viability of those plants, right? Are they still alive? Are they germinated? Do they still have a chance of actually regrowing, or are they no longer viable? Are they dead, right? Are they dead and they're not going to survive that specific area? So we can kind of factor those out. And this actually requires a little bit of patience, right? And the reason I say a little bit of patience because you have to give those plants a little bit of time in order to assess if they are going to regrow. So if you think about, flooding conditions or soil crusting or any other instance that may have impacted the plants, frost damage, right? It's important to actually have some patience so that you can give it a little bit of an estimate, might be 3-4 days, wait a little bit, and then you can actually accurately assess, are we getting some level of regrowth, some germination that is occurring, and get an indication of whether or not some plants may survive or may not survive. But it really starts out with, going to those impacted areas, assessing the stand, counting the stand, and then getting some estimate of what the viability is of those plants within those affected areas, so we can start to understand, okay, how many plants are we losing? How many plants per acre? How much population have we lost in those impacted areas? So not only is it important to assess the overall stand and the overall viability of the plants, often in replant cases where you have poor stand or poor emergence in affected areas of plants, is that you also will notice the evenness or the unevenness of that stand, right? So we might have corn plants that emerge 2, 3, 4 days ahead of their neighbors. So if you notice and walk through that field, you can kind of notice it here in this picture right here. You might have some plants that are at, say, V3, V4, V5 growth stage, and some plants in the impacted area that maybe are only at V1 or V2. So it's still also important to assess what is the level of evenness of those plants remaining. Try and get an estimate of, okay, here's my plant stand, here's how many plants are still viable. Okay, here is where maybe these plants are X growth stage behind these certain plants. So just because plant population isn't impacted doesn't mean that yield still can't be lost, because often where we have plants that are 2, 3, 4 growth stages ahead, their neighbors that are behind often can't catch up, or they may not be able to produce an ear, or they're going to have, some level of yield reductions in those areas. So assessing, not only the stand, the viability, but how even that stand is, and is there some indication of how many growth stages behind are some of those plants in comparison to their neighbors in certain areas in the field. So you still need to assess the uniformity of the remaining stand, try to get a gauge of what the growth stage differences are out in those areas. And also, if you can, get maybe an approximate days difference in that overall emergence. So now if you take your stand counts, you assess the viability and the evenness of the stand, it's now starting to try and understand what that potential yield loss is from the existing stand in those impacted areas, and whether or not we should maybe make that decision to replant or not replant. This is an important aspect, and what we're showcasing here with this figure right here is we're actually taking data from a lot of the seeding rate trials that had been done at Purdue University, where you can look where we actually assessed what the plant population was at harvest and how it actually related to yield. And when you look at this figure, what's really interesting is that you see that even when we get to plant populations that are below 26,000 per acre, or even when we're down to plant populations of, say, 23,000 plants per acre, we can still maintain quite a bit of yield, right? So just because you may have had a farmer that targeted, say, 32,000 seeds per acre, and we're down to, say, 23,000 plants per acre, you may think to yourself, hey, we need to replant this field. But if you look at some of this data, right, a lot of those plants still have the ability to yield. They still have the ability to compensate. So we may not actually need to replant when we're down to about, 24,000 plants per acre. So based on this figure and a lot of the data that we have at Purdue in terms of plant populations in relation to yield, is that around 95% of yield can still be achieved at lower populations. So you look at a plant population difference between 28,000 to 35,000, there's only a 0.5% difference in yield. Or we went from 26,000 to 37,000 plant population, there was only a 1% difference in yield. So it's not really a one-to-one relationship where if I lose, 1-2 plants in a certain area, I lose X amount of bushels per acre, right? So it's not a one-to-one linear relationship. A lot of those plants can still yield pretty well at some of those lower plant populations. So often a starting point for us is often when you get to plant populations lower than 20,000 plants per acre. That may be a good starting point to start assessing whether or not we need to make that replant decision. You can see just by this figure, you get around 23,000 as we start decreasing, that overall relative corn grain yield is going to start to decrease. So that could often be, as gauging a starting point. If we're at 20,000 or we're below 20,000 plants per acre, then we're starting to assess we may be losing some significant yield. So that may be a good starting point when assessing replant decisions. Here's some more data out of Iowa, Iowa State Guide to Iowa Corn Planting. This is based on, AppSim crop models, but this kind of goes a little bit further in terms of assessing when the planting date occurred and actually what that final plant stand is. So this can also be a very good resource to use where, if we're planting a little bit later, right, then the plant stand becomes a little bit more important, right? But if we planted, say, May 5th, and we're down to, say, 24,000, 20,000, we're still gaining 90%, 80 to 90% of the maximum corn yield. But if we're in a later planting date, right, you look at 20,000, 24,000, now we're only about 68% of the maximum corn yield, or 61% of the maximum corn yield. So you still need to also factor in, okay, what date are we planting? How late are we getting in terms of some of that replant? And then also assessing that average plant population per acre in those impacted areas. So this is another resource, right, that you can kind of dive a little bit deeper based on when that planting date was, what is our existing plant stand. This is kind of the estimate of how much corn yield or what percent of that maximum corn yield will we still be at. And then that can help you make that decision whether or not we need to replant or not. Another question, probably one of the big questions we often get from farmers in terms of when they're replanting, because they may have targeted a certain date, may take a little bit of time to assess whether or not we need to replant, and then it's starting to get maybe a little bit later in May, or we may be approaching early June. Is the question they may ask is, do I need to actually change my hybrid, right? So do I need to change the overall maturity of that hybrid? And there's some, good resources out there to help you make this decision. I think the first part is, okay, if you're making the decision, we need to replant, what is the estimate on the date that we are going to make that replant, right? Is it June 1st? Is it May 25th, right? Try and get an estimate on when that replanting date will occur. And then we can actually look at, based on the certain hybrids, look at growing degree days to maturity, right? And this is often based on the hybrid maturity date, hybrid maturity number, but you can actually get these numbers from the specific seed companies. A lot of the seed companies will say, this maturity hybrid and they can give you an estimate of, okay, what is the growing degree days to maturity, right? And maybe based on planting, it may be based on emergence, but get an estimate of what the growing degree days are to maturity. And then you can actually use certain resources to try and gauge what the expected first frost date is in your specific region, because that's often the challenge, right? If we get too late in the season with, say, a replant, and if we have a full season hybrid that we would have used if we planted much earlier, is that plant going to mature in time before that first frost date occurs? So here's a research that Purdue University has from the Midwest Regional Climate Center. We can actually put in your planting date, put in the estimate of growing degree days to maturity, and it will also give you the expected first frost date as well. So this can be a resource that you can use and say, well, if I'm going to plant this certain hybrid at this certain maturity, it may not mature in time based on that first frost date. So maybe I need to make that decision of going to a little bit earlier day maturity hybrid, or based on the replant date, we may see that, hey, that hybrid still has time to mature before that first frost date occurs. It's also important to work with the seed dealer, right? What seed is still currently available? If you're in really big regions that are impacted, that have a lot of replants, a lot of that early maturing seed may be gone already, or could be really hard to come by. So what seed is still currently available? There's a lot of different replant programs based on seed companies. So do we have free seed or discounted replant seed? That can also, have a really big impact in factoring into a replant decision. And also with certain hybrids, right, if you are going to replant a little bit later, target really good disease protection. This is really, really important because a lot of times later plantings can be impacted by more foliar diseases based on that plant hitting more critical growth stages a little bit later in the season, where we have, differences in both moisture, humidity, and temperature. So target really good disease protection in those hybrids that you're making with the replants at a little bit later planting date. And then kind of lastly, you think about estimation of replanting costs. This is often the biggest deciding factor for replants of, okay, what is my potential yield loss and how does that relate to what is it going to cost me in order to make that replant decision, right? So this certain factors to consider is the cost of replant seed. Do I have the opportunity to get free replant seed or discounting replant seed? Is that provided? Factor again, what's the fuel, what's the labor, do I need a herbicide application to kill off the rest of the remaining plants? Do I need fungicide? Do I need drying costs at harvest because I'm planting later and I may harvest later? And costs likely vary for every single farmer and every single environment. So it's really important to work with those individual farmers and their individual locations or operations to help understand what that replant cost is going to be and how does that relate to the potential yield loss we may have. And then lastly, right, another question is often, do we patch in or do we destroy and start over, right? Do I have, kind of variable impacted areas throughout the field? Do I need to just bring my planter in and just patch in those areas? Or should I just terminate the entire field and start over? And for the most part with corn, right, corn can often be very different than soybeans when it comes to some of the replant decisions, is that corn you almost always need to destroy and start over in a field. Patch in really only in severe cases. And what I mean by this is if you have really large areas of missing plants, you may be able to patch in. And this is also where we're really severely impacted by the overall plant stand. So the remaining population is potentially less than 25% of that original target. So really severe, cases. We have a lot of missing plants, then we may be able to patch in. For the most part, and the majority of the time with corn, you almost always need to destroy and start over. And this is due to, corn often deals with the competition with surviving plants, right? And we don't want large variability in plant maturity at harvest, right? If you patch in that corn, you might have certain plants that are maturing and certain plants that are not. And then you think about, the harvest decisions and the challenges with harvests if we have really large swings or variability in plant maturity and harvest. Targeted seeding rates, right? So if you think about starting over the plants, targeted seeding rates can actually remain the same or slightly lower, right? So if we go a little bit later in the season with our replant, we actually may be planting into much warmer soils, so we may have much higher germination success with that later planting in warmer soils. So often we don't see that you need to really alter your seeding rate with a replant, and you may be able to go a little bit on the lower side, but you definitely don't need to go a little bit higher with your overall seeding rate in terms of replants. So to wrap up here, right, replant decisions for corn are not easy because there's so many different factors that play, and there's also so many different, I would say, economic factors that are very different from farmer to farmer or to operation when it comes to making that decision. It's really important to really first, assess what plant population have we lost in those impacted areas, and not only assess that plant population, but what is the viability of those plants? Also, what is the uniformity of that stand in terms of the differences in emergence or differences in growth stage from those plants? And then try to get a gauge based on that data of what our potential yield losses are, right? And missing plants does not mean a direct relationship to yield loss. And we kind of showed that with some of the graphs looking at, plant populations in relation to yield, right? We can often see a difference in, say, 10,000 plants per acre, and the yield difference may only be, 0.5 or 1%. So it's still important to try and gauge, at that certain point, whether it be 20,000 plants per acre, then we might start seeing significant yield losses. And also estimating replant costs, right? And this is going to vary based on operations and farmers and locations. But, do we have tillage costs? Do we have pesticide costs? What is the labor? What is the fuel? Do I have replant seed costs, right? There's a lot of different factors that come in and engaging, is it going to cost? Is it worth it to do the replant? Or based on the estimation of yield loss, is it not worth it to have all these additional costs for that replant? And almost always need to start over with corn, right? Corn does not do very well in terms of patching it in and competing with its neighbors, in certain areas, and also the challenges with having a lot of large variability in harvest moistures. Corn just does not do very well in patch-in scenarios. In terms of replant, you almost always need to start over, except when I talk about the really severe cases where affected areas are very large, and we're also missing, say, 25%, less than 25% of our targeted stand. But you always almost need to start over with corn for replants. So that's kind of an overview of assessing replants and making those decisions. I want to thank you for listening as well. And then, also, this is part of the Crop Protection Network as well. So to give a shout out to them for this presentation. So thank you.